Millionaire CEO breaks down when he learns why these little triplets are working instead of their mother. Hey, beautiful souls. Before we dive into today's emotional story, tell me, where in the world are you watching from right now? And hey, what time is it over there? Drop it in the comments below. I love seeing how far these stories travel and who they're touching around the globe. Now, get ready for a journey that will break your heart and heal it all at once. Let's begin. The honking horns and flashing lights of Fifth Avenue barely registered as Ethan Blake sat behind the wheel of his sleek black Mercedes. The glow from his dashboard screen dim compared to the strange warmth suddenly blooming in his chest when his eyes landed on two tiny figures across the sidewalk. Their pink frocks dusty at the hem and their golden curls catching the late afternoon sun like fragile halos. They looked no older than 8, standing behind a small cart, hand-painted with hearts and sprinkles, holding out trays of slightly uneven but lovingly made cupcakes and donuts with a brave smile that trembled beneath their bright blue eyes. Something in those eyes pierced through Ethan's polished exterior, past the layers of business meetings, private jets, and empty boardroom applause, straight into a space he hadn't visited in years, where vulnerability lived. He leaned closer to the window, narrowing his gaze as the girls eagerly waved at passing strangers, their voices high but worn out from hours of repeating, $1, sir, fresh and sweet like our mama used to make, with a hope that didn't match the worn soles of their shoes or the bruises on their tiny knuckles. Unable to resist, he pulled over and stepped out, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the pavement as he approached them slowly, his usual confident gait softened by the weight of what he was witnessing. The girls lit up, their smiles sincere, not performative, as if every customer was a miracle. Would you like chocolate or strawberry? The taller one asked, while the other nudged a donut forward carefully, trying not to drop it. Ethan reached into his wallet, handed them a 20, but the smaller girl gently pushed it back, whispering, "We can't take more, sir. Mama says we have to earn it fair." And Ethan stood there stunned, a lump rising in his throat at the purity of their pride. He took a bite of the cupcake. It was imperfect but warm, sweet, and filled with something he couldn't name, like a mother's lullaby baked into flour and sugar. He lingered beside their cart, asking questions they gracefully dodged, and when he offered them his coat to shield against the breeze, they declined again, wrapping their arms around each other like tiny warriors born of necessity. People passed by without truly seeing them, but Ethan did. He saw the fatigue beneath their excitement, the silent coordination between them as they restocked their tray, wiped away crumbs, and whispered reassurances to each other in between customers. One of them coughed lightly, and the other instinctively placed a hand on her back, rubbing gently as if rehearsed 1,000 times. Ethan's heart twisted. These were children, yet they carried burdens like grown women, and something about their quiet strength haunted him. For hours he sat in his car, pretending to work, but his eyes remained on them, watching how they never argued, how their faces lit up when someone paid, how they counted coins together with giggles that faded as the sun dipped lower, and their smiles slowly began to wilt under the weight of the day. Ethan canceled 2 meetings without caring for the first time in years, unable to pull away, caught in the silent spell cast by these little strangers and the invisible story that wrapped around them like a forgotten lullaby. When one cupcake fell to the ground, the girls looked at it like a loss too expensive to cry over, and it made him ache in a place money couldn't reach. A businessman tossed them a crumpled dollar without looking, and Ethan clenched his fists, realizing how easily the world overlooks those who suffer with grace. The older girl wiped her sister's face with the corner of her frock and whispered something that made them both smile again, and Ethan thought it was the bravest thing he'd ever seen. The wind picked up, fluttering their sign that read, "Mama's Treats," and he felt a jolt in his gut. Where was their mother, and why weren't they in school, playing, laughing, being loved instead of laboring? He opened his window again, tempted to call them over, but something held him back. Maybe respect, maybe awe, maybe fear of intruding on something fragile and sacred. Their cartwheels squeaked as they pushed it forward a few feet, realigning to catch the evening crowd, and Ethan followed them with his eyes, unable to look away. unaware that this quiet moment, born from coincidence, was about to lead him into a story deeper than he ever expected, into the heart of a family broken but not beaten, into a love far more real than any he'd known, and into the arms of two little girls who unknowingly began healing a man who had everything except purpose. As the next morning sun poured over the bustling city, Ethan found himself driving past the towering skyline, not to his office as usual, but back to the sidewalk on Fifth Avenue, where something inside him had been quietly left the day before. He didn't fully understand why, but the image of those two fragile little girls had taken root in his chest, growing heavier with every breath he took without doing something. Parking discreetly across the street, he spotted them again. Only today, the wind was harsher, and the cart looked heavier, its little front wheel stuck in a crack of the uneven pavement as the girls leaned their tiny bodies against it, trying to push it up a small incline, their arms trembling, cheeks flushed from effort, and their legs barely steady beneath them. Ethan's heart clenched, and he rushed over without hesitation, gently placing his hand on the handlebar and guiding the cart forward with ease, startling the girls until they looked up and recognized the man from yesterday, the one who hadn't just seen them, but truly noticed them. "Good morning, ladies," he said softly, kneeling down to their level, his voice tender as he studied their faces, noting the shadows under their eyes, the stiff way they stood like their little bodies were still recovering from exhaustion. The taller one offered a hesitant smile, then glanced at her sister before quietly saying, "I'm Lila, and this is my twin sister, Mia." And for some reason, hearing their names made it all the more real. These weren't just sweet strangers on a street corner. They were little girls with names, histories, and stories no child should carry. Ethan repeated their names gently, like they were something sacred, committing them to memory with a reverence usually reserved for prayers. He asked where their mother was today, and the shift in their posture was instant. Shoulders tensed, eyes dropped, and Mia clutched her sister's hand before Lila's voice broke the silence, barely above a whisper. "Mommy's legs don't work anymore. A car hit her while she was selling cupcakes like us." The words came out brittle, like glass cracking beneath weight, and Ethan had to swallow hard to steady himself. The image of a mother struck down while trying to provide, twisting painfully in his chest. "Now we do it for her," Mia added, her small voice filled with pride and pain all at once. And Ethan looked at them, not as helpless children, but as little warriors, fighting battles life had never prepared them for. He offered again to help, to buy them supplies, warm clothes, maybe even food. But their answer was soft and unwavering. "Mama says we can't take anything we didn't earn." And the humility in their words cut deeper than any plea for help ever could. Ethan found himself unable to argue, struck by the nobility wrapped inside their broken circumstances. For the next hour, he didn't leave. He stayed with them, helped carry trays, adjusted signs when they blew down, and spoke to every passing stranger, not as a CEO, but as someone suddenly desperate to bring light into their world. When Lila drew a tiny hardened frosting on one of the cupcakes and gave it to him with a grin, he laughed softly, something he hadn't done from the soul in years. "It's our thank you cupcake," she said, and wrote Ethan in crooked pink icing beside the heart. And he stared at it like it was the most priceless gift he'd ever received. Customers started to notice their cart more, drawn in by the sight of a well-dressed man crouching beside two little girls with frosting on their cheeks and sincerity in their eyes. And by the time dusk fell, they had sold nearly everything. As the girls packed up, Ethan offered to drive them home, but they politely declined, saying, "Mama says we always walk together, no matter how far." And his respect for their unseen mother deepened. That night, Ethan lay awake in his penthouse, staring at the ceiling, unable to erase their faces from his mind. The resilience in their smiles, the ache in their voices, the truth that some families survive not by chance, but by choosing love every single day. He remembered how Mia rubbed her sister's arm when she got cold, and how Lila always made sure Mia's coat was zipped first before thinking of her own, and it all felt too intimate to be left ignored. Something inside him cracked open, a door long sealed by business goals and emotional detachment, and through it poured the need to protect, to nurture, to be present in a way he hadn't been for anyone in years. It wasn't just sympathy, it was connection, fierce and pure, and it scared him because he knew this wasn't going to be a one-time kindness or a simple donation. It was the beginning of something life-altering, something that would force him to choose between the world he built and the one he might finally belong to. As Ethan sat in his penthouse with the city lights flickering beneath his windows, the image of Lila gently zipping Mia's coat and whispering reassurances haunted him more than the blinking red notifications from investors piling into his phone. So when twilight returned and the world began to slow, he found himself quietly slipping out, following the girls at a safe distance as they pushed their now empty cart through winding sidewalks and cracked alleys that no billionaire should ever have to see, his heart pounding not with fear, but with something unfamiliar. Grief laced with guilt. They didn't notice him as they turned onto a narrow street where streetlights flickered, past graffiti-stained walls and rusted trash bins, finally stopping at a dilapidated apartment complex that sagged under the weight of time and neglect. Broken windows stared back like hollow eyes as Lila tugged the heavy cart up 3 concrete steps with effort far too great for her tiny frame, while Mia opened a rusty door with a bent key that squeaked like it hadn't been oiled in years. Ethan remained hidden in the shadows, breath held, as he watched them disappear inside, the door creaking shut behind them like a secret swallowed by the dark. He crept closer and peeked through a narrow slit in the curtainless window, heart slamming against his chest when he saw the dim glow of a single bulb illuminating a small bare room with water-stained walls and peeling wallpaper, where the girls knelt beside a fragile woman in a wheelchair. Her body was thin, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch their faces, her smile bright but fleeting as exhaustion overtook her joy. Ethan's throat tightened as he realized this was their mother, the woman whose love still burned fiercely despite being trapped in a body that could no longer chase buses or bake in the sun. He watched as Lila placed a half-eaten cupcake in her mother's hands like it was a royal offering, and Mia rubbed her shoulders, whispering words Ethan couldn't hear but felt in his bones. The room had no heat, no comfort, just the kind of love money couldn't buy, and it crushed him. Unable to bear the weight of witnessing, without helping, he turned and walked away, his steps heavy, mind reeling, the silence between each heartbeat filled with shame for every time he had looked past someone else's struggle. He sat in his car for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, fighting emotions that had no boardroom language, no polished response. And when tears finally came, he let them fall, unashamed. Because the truth was, this little family had exposed something raw in him, something that years of corporate triumphs had buried. The next morning he returned to the same crumbling doorstep, this time not hiding, carrying a warm box of food and a humble request to speak with their mother. The girls hesitated at first, confused but not afraid, and after a moment they nodded and guided him inside, their trust given without question, like they could feel something good in him even if he hadn't yet proved it. Claire blinked in surprise when she saw him, her eyes widening as the man from yesterday's sidewalk stepped into her world of linoleum floors and chipped furniture. But instead of panic, there was dignity in her posture, and she offered a quiet, "Hello," though her fingers gripped the armrest of her wheelchair with caution. Ethan sat down on a wooden stool, hands resting on his knees like a student before a teacher, and gently asked about her story. What poured out next shattered him further. How Claire once dreamed of owning a bakery, how she used to sing to her daughters as she whisked batter at sunrise, how she set up a cart when rent climbed and life pinched tighter, how one rainy day a careless driver ran a red light, hitting her while she was crossing with a tray of freshly iced cupcakes, how she woke up to silence in her legs and fear in her heart for her children's future. Ethan listened without blinking, without breathing, holding every word like it was precious. And when Claire, voice trembling, said, "I didn't want their childhood lost to hunger," he felt something inside him collapse, a dam breaking loose not just from sorrow, but from admiration so intense it frightened him. She didn't want pity, didn't want rescue, just a chance for her girls to remain children a little longer in a world that had already asked them to grow up too fast. When Ethan stood to leave, his jaw clenched against the storm building behind his eyes. He barely made it to his car before the sobs came. Silent at first, then heaving, shattering every wall he had built, because for the first time in a decade, he wasn't crying out of regret or loneliness. He was crying because he had seen a kind of courage that made his wealth feel irrelevant. And for the first time in years, he felt completely, terrifyingly human. As Ethan sat in his car, the tears still wet on his face, his heart beaten open by the strength of a woman who had built a kingdom out of crumbs, he knew this couldn't be the end of his part in their story. It had to be the beginning of something greater, something that preserved their dignity while quietly rewriting their future. He spent the night sketching out plans, not for profit or applause, but for purpose, for a way to lift them without making them feel small. By morning, he returned to their humble apartment, not with charity, but with a proposal wrapped in respect and admiration. Standing in their doorway, he smiled and said, "Claire, I'd like to invest in your business. Not donate, but partner." And for a moment the air stilled, confusion and caution flickering in her eyes as she blinked at the man who looked like a billionaire, but spoke like a friend. She opened her mouth to protest, but before she could, Lila jumped up with joy, tugging Mia's hand, shouting, "Mama! We could call it Mama's Magic Muffins!" A name so innocent, yet powerful, that even Claire's resistance began to soften. Still she hesitated, torn between pride and desperation. But Ethan gently reassured her, explaining how he could build them a mobile cart, help them reach more customers, and make it all legal, safe, and sustainable. Something they could truly own. Reluctantly, Claire agreed. And what followed were the most beautiful days the little family had seen in years. The new cart arrived, painted with pastel blues and gold stars, their brand name in bubbly white letters, and a small picture of a cupcake cradled in two hands, a symbol of love holding on despite storms. Ethan hired a local assistant to help Claire with deliveries, got her a proper wheelchair with back support, and took time every evening to teach Lila and Mia how to count profits, record customer feedback, and handle digital orders with a tablet he gifted them. They giggled through learning curves and glowed with confidence as lines began forming outside their cart. For the first time, they weren't just surviving, they were thriving. But beneath the joy, something else stirred in Ethan. Every moment spent with Claire deepened the bond forming in his soul, and the walls he had spent years building around his heart began to collapse with every soft smile she gave him and every glance that lingered just a second longer than it should. Her courage was magnetic, her wisdom quiet but sharp, and soon he realized that he wasn't just investing in her business. He was falling in love with the life she had fought to protect, a life that had reawakened something buried in him long ago. But just when everything felt like it was finally aligning, fate struck a cruel note. An envelope arrived at Claire's door with a legal threat from the very man who had hit her, the reckless driver who had never paid for the damage he caused. He now claimed that the food cart's presence was unsafe and demanded a financial settlement to avoid a fabricated lawsuit, knowing well the family couldn't afford court. Claire trembled as she read the letter aloud, her hands shaking with a mix of rage and fear, and Ethan's expression darkened, his jaw clenching as a protective fire surged through him. He had seen many manipulative cowards in his corporate career, but this was personal. This man wasn't just targeting a business, he was trying to destroy the only light left in these girls' lives. Claire wanted to handle it quietly, but Ethan couldn't let this slide. Not when the threat wasn't just legal, it was emotional, psychological, a looming shadow threatening to snuff out the joy he had just begun helping them rebuild. He spent the night crafting a strategy, calling in favors from lawyers he trusted, digging into the past of the man who had hurt them, uncovering lies, unpaid tickets, and a history of intimidation that no court would ignore. Yet Ethan kept his plans secret, not wanting to scare the girls or burden Claire. But his silence buzzed with tension. Every smile he gave was laced with worry, every moment of laughter dimmed slightly by the ticking clock of the threat hovering over their heads. Still, he never showed weakness in front of them, only determination, only belief that this family, so small and fragile looking on the outside, deserved a world that wouldn't keep breaking them. And though Claire didn't know the full extent of what he was preparing, Something in her eyes said she trusted him, not just as a businessman, but as a man who had become the anchor in the storm. She could no longer fight alone. Ethan spent the next few sleepless nights pulling strings, contacting top attorneys, and working with a private investigator who uncovered everything he needed. Evidence of the driver's negligence, his previous intimidation tactics, and even a forged document meant to extort Claire. Armed with undeniable proof, Ethan filed a counter-lawsuit so powerful it sent the man running before the court date ever arrived, finally lifting the weight that had lingered on Claire's shoulders for far too long. When he shared the news with her, she broke down, not in fear this time, but in relief, her tears falling silently as she covered her mouth with trembling hand, whispering, "I don't know how to thank you." And Ethan simply replied, "You already have." Soon after, the cupcake cart was replaced by a gleaming food truck wrapped in pastel colors and the words, "Mama's Magic Muffins," in bold, swirly letters, a beacon of resilience and sweetness parked daily at the heart of the city. Customers lined up around the block, drawn by the delicious pastries but staying for the story behind them. Two little girls who never gave up, and a mother whose spirit couldn't be broken. Local news stations aired their journey, sharing Claire's voice and the laughter of Lila and Mia with the world, sparking waves of donations that poured in not as pity, but as admiration, funding Claire's intensive physical therapy and advanced care at a state-of-the-art rehabilitation center. The girls became little celebrities in their neighborhood, signing cupcake boxes with crayons while Ethan, quietly in the background, made sure everything ran perfectly. Not just the business, but their lives. He never missed a therapy session, never skipped a night at the truck, and slowly became more than just a partner. He became a fixture, a protector, a gentle force weaving love into the cracks of their once fractured home. One evening, under golden fairy lights strung above the truck like stars brought down just for them, Claire sat beside him with a soft smile and glossy eyes, her voice breaking as she whispered, "No one ever fought for us like this, not even their real father." And Ethan, overwhelmed by the weight of her trust, dropped to one knee, not in proposal, but in heart, to face Lila and Mia eye to eye. "Would you two mind," he asked softly, his voice filled with emotion, "if I became that person for you?" And without hesitation, they threw themselves into his arms, giggling and crying, holding him like a missing puzzle piece finally found. That night marked a shift, not just in their journey, but in their souls. The family they had lost in pieces was now whole in a way none of them could have imagined. Months passed, each day brighter than the last, and the world watched as Claire, after months of painful therapy and unwavering support, stood again for the first time, legs trembling, heart steady, as Lila held one hand, Mia the other, and Ethan stood across from her, with tears silently rolling down his cheeks. She walked slowly but proudly across the grass, a soft white dress flowing around her knees, toward the man who had once been a stranger but was now her anchor, her friend, her love, and in front of a small crowd of cheering neighbors, loyal customers, and tearful reporters. Ethan pulled out a velvet box and asked the question that needed no answer, because the way Claire smiled, radiant and sure, already said everything. She nodded, voice shaking, "Yes, 1,000 times." And as he slipped the ring onto her finger, Lila and Mia ran to them, shouting, "We have a dad now!" As they wrapped their arms around his waist and buried their faces in his coat, a picture-perfect moment frozen in time as flashbulbs clicked and the world around them applauded. Not for the wealth, not for the cupcakes, but for the miracle that love, strength, and second chances had created. That night, beneath a sky full of stars, Claire leaned into Ethan's chest, whispering, "You didn't just change our lives. You became it." And with the girls nestled between them and their food truck glowing like a lighthouse of hope, their story closed not with an ending, but with a beginning more beautiful than they ever dared to dream.